Welcome to Hidden Chapters. Nothing went wrong here. That's why this story matters. Let's begin. He wasn't armed. He wasn't a threat. I spared him anyway. I still remember exactly where I was standing when I made the decision. The floor was littered with things no one would catalog later. Broken furniture. Dust. The smell of fuel mixed with something older, something human. The operation had already gone long, and command wanted it finished cleanly. No delays. No complications. Organized crime doesn't collapse quietly. It fractures, and those fractures cut whoever is closest. We moved room by room, methodical, controlled. Names on a list. Faces that matched photos. Every movement rehearsed enough times that muscle memory carried more weight than thought. That's when I saw him. He wasn't where the others were hiding. He wasn't trying to run or fight. He was pressed into a narrow space behind a wall that didn't reach the ceiling, knees pulled in, hands empty and visible. His eyes tracked us with the kind of focus that comes from knowing noise would end badly. He wasn't armed. That matters more than people think. The feed didn't catch him. The angle was wrong. From command's perspective, the room was already cleared. I could have taken one step back, reported nothing, and let the moment disappear into the report like everything else. Instead, I paused. He looked older than the others. Not old, just worn in a way that suggested years of standing too close to things he couldn't control. When our eyes met, he didn't beg. He didn't explain. He didn't move at all. That scared me more than panic would have. Clear, someone behind me said. I didn't repeat it. Time stretched into something thin and uncomfortable. Seconds matter in operations like this, but so does judgment. We're trained to see threats, not people. To resolve situations, not sit inside them. I stepped closer, blocking the angle just enough to keep him out of sight. He whispered something I didn't catch. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't gratitude. It sounded more like acknowledgement, like he already understood what was happening and what wasn't supposed to. I made a calculation without writing it down. He didn't fit the mission profile. He wasn't a target. He wasn't a threat. But he was connected. That's where the line blurred. If I followed procedure exactly, he would disappear into processing, interrogation, and whatever came after that. If I didn't, he would disappear another way, into a life that would never intersect with mine again. At least, that's what I told myself. I gestured once. Small. Controlled. A direction away from us, toward an opening that would take him out of the structure before anyone noticed. He hesitated. Then he stood, slow enough not to startle anyone, and moved exactly where I'd indicated. No sound. No rush. Just a man walking out of a moment he hadn't survived on paper. When the room was finally logged and the unit moved on, I added nothing. No footnote. No correction. The absence fit cleanly into the report. The mission ended the way it was supposed to. I didn't think about him again for a long time. That's the lie we tell ourselves, that mercy is contained. That it ends where the decision does. I let one man walk away. And at the time, I believed that was the end of the story. Time has a way of smoothing sharp decisions. Not erasing them, just rounding the edges until they don't cut as deeply when you remember them. After that operation, life moved the way it always does. New assignments. New regions. New problems that demanded attention immediately and left little room for reflection. That's how it stayed buried. The man without a weapon became a detail without weight. A moment filed away under things that didn't matter anymore. There was no reason to revisit it. No report flagged. No follow-up questions. The system absorbed the absence without resistance. That's what systems do best. Years passed. I learned to trust outcomes more than intentions. Missions ended. Organizations fractured and reformed under new names. Faces changed. Methods stayed the same. Organized crime doesn't vanish, it adapts, embedding itself into structures that look legitimate from a distance. I adapted too. The older you get in this work, the less you think about singular moments. You focus on patterns. Trends. Movement over time. Decisions stop feeling personal once they're layered under enough repetition. Until something breaks the pattern. It happened during a routine briefing, the kind you half listen to while skimming slides you've already seen versions of. Names cycled across the screen, flagged entities, areas of interest. Then one name stopped me. Not because it was familiar. Because it wasn't. It shouldn't have been there at all. The file attached to it was thin in the wrong way. Clean, but not empty. Structured, but missing context. Someone had built it carefully, adding just enough detail to justify attention without explaining why it existed. That kind of file doesn't appear by accident. I didn't react. I didn't ask questions. You learn early not to reveal recognition when you don't yet understand its shape. Instead, I watched how others responded. Who lingered on the slide? Who avoided looking at it altogether? That told me more than the data did. The name appeared again a few weeks later, this time tied to a different network. Different geography. Same gaps. Same careful lack of explanation. Someone had learned how to move between systems without triggering alarms. That's when memory surfaced. Not his face, that had faded. But the posture. The stillness. The way he hadn't begged. The way he'd moved when I gave him the chance. He hadn't disappeared. He'd evolved. The realization didn't come with regret. It came with weight. Because mercy doesn't exist in isolation. It travels forward, intersecting with choices you'll never see. I began tracking the name quietly. Not officially. Not through channels that create trails. Just watching where it surfaced, where it didn't, and who seemed relieved when it vanished again. Something larger was moving. And somehow, the man I'd spared was standing at the edge of it. I told myself it was coincidence. I needed it to be. Because if it wasn't, if that single decision had shifted something years later, then the story wasn't over. It had just been waiting long enough. For me to forget I was still part of it. I didn't go looking for him. That's important. If I had, it would have meant admitting something to myself I wasn't ready to name. Instead, I let the information come the way it wanted to, indirectly, unevenly, always just short of confirmation. The name surfaced again during an interagency exchange. Different format. Different language. Same structure. Clean entries where complexity should have been. Activity without attribution. Movement without ownership. Whoever he was now, he knew how to exist between jurisdictions. I started noticing what followed his appearances. Operations disrupted without confrontation. Routes that went cold overnight. Networks that dissolved without a visible trigger. Not arrests. Not collapses. Just quiet withdrawals, as if something had warned them before pressure arrived. Warnings don't come from nowhere. I compared timelines. Not obsessively, just enough to see the overlap. Each time his name appeared, something else failed to happen. A shipment didn't move. A meeting didn't occur. A transfer never reached its destination. He wasn't causing chaos. He was preventing it. That realization sat badly with me. Not because it was threatening, but because it complicated everything I thought I understood about the decision I'd made years ago. Mercy is easy to justify when it disappears into the past. It's harder when it shows up reshaped and active. I requested access to one of the files tied to his name. Not directly. Through a chain long enough to blur intent. When it came through, it confirmed what I'd suspected. He wasn't listed as an asset. He wasn't listed as a target. He existed in a third category that doesn't get talked about, individuals who affect outcomes without belonging to any side willing to claim them. That's a dangerous place to stand. The more I read, the clearer it became that he'd positioned himself carefully. Never close enough to be visible. Never far enough to be irrelevant. He knew where pressure was building and where it would break. And he was intervening. Not out of loyalty. Not out of ideology. Out of calculation. That's when the past finally caught up with me. I remembered his eyes in that narrow space, the way he'd watched without fear or confusion. He'd been measuring then, too. Not me, the situation. He hadn't survived by chance. He'd survived because he knew when to stay still. I closed the file and logged out. The room around me felt smaller, like the walls had shifted inward without moving. I understood now that whatever he'd become, it wasn't accidental. My decision hadn't spared a life that faded into obscurity. It had allowed something adaptive to continue. The question wasn't whether that was a mistake. The question was whether it was already too late to undo it. Because if he was now the reason certain things never happened, if he was quietly shaping outcomes, then stopping him might cost more than letting him continue. And suddenly, mercy wasn't a memory. It was a variable. One that had followed me across years and operations, waiting for the moment when I'd finally be forced to account for it. That moment was getting closer. I could feel it in the way the briefings changed tone. In the way certain threats were described as contained without explanation. In the way silence began to appear where certainty used to live. The man I wasn't supposed to spare had survived. And now, he was standing between us and something worse. Whether I liked it or not. The story was moving toward a second decision. One that wouldn't be mine alone. The moment I accepted that he was intervening, everything else changed. Patterns sharpen when you stop denying them. What had looked like coincidence turned into structure. Every quiet disruption followed the same rhythm, pressure building, a warning appearing just early enough, then withdrawal. Not chaos. Control. That kind of restraint doesn't come from ideology. It comes from experience. I asked for a deeper assessment under the pretense of risk analysis. Framed it as curiosity, not concern. The response came back slower than usual, filtered through more hands than necessary. That told me the question itself had landed somewhere sensitive. When the analysis finally arrived, it didn't mention his name. Instead, it described an emerging stabilizing factor. Someone or something that reduced escalation without claiming credit. The language was careful, neutral, almost respectful. That unsettled me. We're trained to identify threats, not moderators. When something interferes with conflict in a way that doesn't align with policy, it creates discomfort. It forces people to choose between control and outcome. That's where mercy becomes expensive. I realized then that my decision years ago hadn't simply allowed him to live. It had removed him from categories that make action easy. He wasn't an enemy to neutralize or an ally to protect. He was a variable no one fully understood. And variables make planners nervous. I received a message later that day, brief, indirect, routed through channels designed to avoid attribution. A meeting request. No subject line. No explanation. Just a location and a time. I knew what it meant. They weren't asking for intelligence. They were asking for judgment. In the room, the conversation never named him. It didn't need to. We spoke in abstractions, about external influences, unaligned actors, unpredictable stabilizers. People weighed options without committing to them. Remove the variable. Monitor it. Leverage it. Each suggestion carried a cost no one wanted to calculate out loud. When they asked for my input, I answered carefully. I talked about outcomes instead of methods. About the risks of forcing resolution where equilibrium existed. About how removing one pressure point could shift weight elsewhere. No one disagreed. No one agreed either. That's how you know a room understands the problem but hasn't accepted it yet. As the meeting ended, I felt the weight settle properly for the first time. Mercy had consequences not because it was wrong, but because it refused to stay contained. It kept working long after the moment passed. I walked out knowing something had been decided without being written down. Not action. Not inaction. Delay. And delay, I'd learned, can be just as intentional as force. Somewhere beyond our reach, the man I'd spared was still moving, still adjusting outcomes quietly. He wasn't doing it for us. He wasn't doing it against us. He was doing it because he knew what happened when no one intervened. That's the burden of mercy no one prepares you for. It doesn't end the story. It keeps it alive long enough to demand something else from you. And I was beginning to understand that the second cost would be higher than the first, because this time, choosing nothing would also be a choice. One that history wouldn't forgive as easily. The message didn't come through official channels. It never would have. It arrived as a fragment, a reference buried inside unrelated traffic, a phrase that didn't belong where it appeared. Most people would have skimmed past it without noticing. I stopped because it used language I hadn't seen since that night years ago. Careful. Measured. Exact. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a request. It was an invitation. I didn't respond immediately. You don't answer a door like that without understanding who else might be listening. Instead, I watched what happened around it. Data shifted. Routes changed. Pressure moved away from places it had been building for months. He was still shaping things. And now he knew I was watching. When I finally replied, I kept it minimal. No questions. No acknowledgement of history. Just confirmation that I understood the timing. The response came quickly, as if he'd been waiting for proof I hadn't forgotten how to read between lines. We didn't arrange a meeting. We aligned movements. That's how people like him operate now, not in places, but in windows. I adjusted my travel schedule under the cover of unrelated work, arriving in a city that mattered less for what it was than for what passed through it. The contact happened without ceremony. A public space. Neutral. Loud enough to hide intent, ordinary enough to avoid notice. He didn't approach me directly. He passed close enough for words to be exchanged without stopping. You let me leave, he said quietly. I never forgot that. I didn't do it for thanks, I replied. I know, he said. That's why this works. That was all. No names. No confirmation. No explanation of what he'd become. He moved on, disappearing into motion like he'd practiced doing for years. The information arrived later, broken across channels I knew how to assemble. Not intelligence in the traditional sense. Context. Patterns. A picture forming around a threat that was still mostly invisible. Something was coming. Bigger than the networks we'd been watching. More patient. Less interested in profit than in permanence. The kind of operation that doesn't rush because it doesn't need to. He was trying to stop it. Not alone. But without support he could trust. That was the real consequence of mercy. By sparing him, I'd created a future where I'd be asked to choose again, not between life and death, but between order and outcome. Between dismantling someone who didn't fit and accepting help that couldn't be controlled. He'd become the only piece close enough to see what was forming. And now, whether I wanted to admit it or not, I was the only one close enough to understand why he mattered. The cost was clear. If I brought him fully into the system, it would consume him. Neutralize his effectiveness. Turn him into something predictable. If I cut him loose again, whatever he was holding back would move forward unchallenged. There was no clean option. Just another line, narrowing fast. And this time, I wasn't standing alone on it. I was standing opposite a man I'd once let walk away, knowing that the next decision wouldn't just decide his future. It would decide whether mercy was a weakness. Or the only thing standing between us and something far worse. Trust didn't arrive with agreement. It arrived with limits. After the contact, nothing changed on the surface. No alerts. No escalations. No sudden movements that would suggest coordination. That was intentional. If anything visible shifted, it would mean we'd already lost control of the shape of things. Instead, we began exchanging absence. He didn't send me locations. He sent gaps. Meetings that didn't happen. Transfers that stalled without explanation. Names that vanished from circulation weeks earlier than expected. Each absence pointed to a pressure point, a place where intervention mattered most. I learned to read the pattern quickly. He was mapping something that didn't want to be mapped. An operation built to look fragmented, independent, small enough to ignore until it aligned. Not criminal in the traditional sense. Structural. Embedded. Stopping it wouldn't look like success. It would look like nothing happening at all. That's why he'd survived this long. I kept my involvement indirect. I nudged processes instead of issuing orders. I delayed approvals under plausible reasons. I redirected attention toward visible threats while leaving the real one in shadow long enough to collapse under its own weight. From the outside, it looked like inefficiency. From the inside, it was coordination without fingerprints. We never spoke again directly. That mattered. Direct contact creates dependency. Dependency creates exposure. Instead, we operated in parallel, connected only by the understanding that neither of us could act openly without destroying the advantage we had. There were moments I considered ending it. Turning him in. Forcing resolution. Letting the system handle what it was designed to handle. It would have been easier. Cleaner. Safer for me. But every time I traced the outcome forward, it ended the same way. Escalation. Collateral. Something worse filling the vacuum. Mercy had already changed the equation. Now responsibility was doing the harder thing. The threat began to fracture. Not dramatically. Not publicly. Just enough that funding streams dried up. Logistics failed. Trust eroded between people who'd never intended to rely on each other. The structure couldn't withstand pressure it didn't recognize. That's how you dismantle something patient. You make it doubt itself. One night, as I reviewed another quiet failure in the chain, I realized something else had changed. I wasn't waiting for consequences anymore. I was managing them. That's the real weight of mercy, it doesn't absolve you. It commits you. It binds you to outcomes you didn't choose but now influence. I wondered if he understood that too. If sparing him had saved me as much as it had saved him, from becoming someone who only knew how to end things cleanly. The operation we were disrupting never collapsed in a way that could be celebrated. No headlines. No acknowledgements. Just a gradual absence of threat where one had been forming. That was the goal. And when it was over, when the pressure finally lifted, there was no signal to mark the end. No message. No confirmation. Just the quiet sense that something dangerous had failed to become permanent. I never saw him again. I didn't need to. The alliance wasn't built to last. It was built to exist long enough to prevent something worse, and then disappear before it could be claimed by anyone. Years earlier, I'd let one man walk away. Now I understood the full cost of that decision. It wasn't mercy. It was obligation. And once you accept it, there's no walking away at all. After it ended, nothing announced itself. No confirmation crossed my desk. No briefing summarized success. The threat simply stopped advancing, like a tide that had reached its limit and decided not to return. People noticed the absence, but no one knew how to name it. That's how these things survive scrutiny. I returned to routine, but routine felt thinner now. Less automatic. Decisions carried more weight because I could see farther down their paths than I used to. Once you understand how easily outcomes can be shaped quietly, it's hard to pretend you're only following procedure. Files closed themselves. Projects were reassigned. Attention moved on to louder problems that demanded visible solutions. The space we'd been working in emptied slowly, leaving nothing behind that could be traced back. That was intentional. I wondered, sometimes, what he did next. Whether he disappeared completely or shifted into another margin where influence mattered more than presence. People like him don't stop observing. They just change vantage points. I also wondered what would have happened if I'd made the opposite choice years ago. If I'd followed the rule instead of my instinct. The answer wasn't dramatic. It was quieter than that. The operation would have continued. The threat would have grown. And eventually, someone else would have paid for it. That knowledge settled into something like acceptance. Mercy isn't about kindness. It's about risk, choosing to carry uncertainty forward instead of ending it immediately. When it works, no one notices. When it doesn't, the cost is impossible to ignore. I carried the weight of that long after the final absence confirmed itself. One evening, reviewing unrelated material, I came across a name that should have meant nothing. It wasn't his. It wasn't connected. But it fit the pattern, clean, incomplete, carefully placed. I closed the file without comment. Some lessons don't need to be repeated. I never spoke about him. Not to colleagues. Not to command. Not even to myself in any structured way. The story stayed exactly where it belonged, outside the record, influencing outcomes without claiming credit. That's the danger of mercy. It teaches you that restraint can be as powerful as force, and far more difficult to justify. Once you understand that, you can't go back to simple answers. As time passed, the memory of his face faded again. Not because it wasn't important, but because it no longer needed to be vivid. What mattered wasn't who he was. It was what he prevented. And the fact that prevention rarely feels like victory. It feels like silence. I learned to live with that silence, to accept that some of the most important decisions you'll ever make will never be validated, never be acknowledged, and never be undone. They just become part of the landscape you move through afterward. The man who wasn't supposed to survive had done more than live. He had changed the shape of what followed. And so had I. Whether that made us responsible or simply aware was something I still hadn't fully decided. But I knew one thing for certain. Mercy had consequences. And once you choose it, you don't get to decide when those consequences end. The weight didn't fade with time. It settled. That's the difference no one warns you about. Guilt burns and then exhausts itself. Fear sharpens and dulls. But responsibility, real responsibility, becomes part of how you measure everything afterward. Months passed without incident. Then years. The systems I worked within stabilized again, confident in their ability to respond to visible threats. New frameworks replaced old ones. New language replaced uncomfortable questions. From the outside, it looked like progress. From where I stood, it looked like memory being paved over. I stopped looking for his name entirely. Not because it frightened me, but because searching would have meant I was still waiting for something to return. Whatever role he'd played was finished. If it hadn't been, I would have felt it in the pressure patterns, in the sudden tightening of space where nothing should have been forming. Nothing did. That was the proof. One afternoon, I was asked to brief a younger team, not on operations, but on judgment. The kind of briefing that avoids specifics and focuses on principles no one can quantify. I spoke about restraint. About understanding when force creates more instability than it resolves. They listened politely. I didn't expect them to understand yet. Understanding like that doesn't come from instruction. It comes from standing at the edge of a decision that won't announce itself. Afterward, one of them stayed behind. He didn't ask about tactics. He asked a single question. How do you know when to stop? I didn't answer right away. Because the truth is, you don't. You act, and then you carry the outcome forward until it teaches you what the decision actually was. Only then do you understand what you chose. I told him that. He nodded, uncertain, and left with more weight than he'd arrived with. That was unavoidable. Later that night, alone, I thought about the man again, not as a variable, not as a factor in some abstract equation, but as a person who'd stepped out of a moment that should have ended him. He'd lived with the consequences too. Whatever path he'd taken afterward, it hadn't been easy. People don't become invisible by accident. It takes discipline, restraint, and constant awareness of how fragile balance really is. In another life, we might have ended up on opposite sides again. In this one, we didn't. That mattered. Mercy didn't turn him into something better or worse. It turned him into something consequential. And by choosing not to erase him, I'd tied myself to that consequence permanently. That's the part people miss. Mercy doesn't absolve you. It commits you. As the years stretched on, I stopped thinking of the decision as a moment at all. It wasn't something that happened. It was something that continued. Quietly. Persistently. Without asking whether I was ready to keep carrying it. And I did. Not because I had to. But because once you understand the cost of mercy, walking away from it becomes its own kind of failure. The man who wasn't supposed to survive had done his part. So had I. What remained wasn't a story with an ending. It was a line you keep walking, long after everyone else believes the road behind you has disappeared. It came back to me without warning. Not his name. Not his face. A situation. A region I hadn't looked at in years started showing signs of pressure again, the kind that doesn't announce itself with violence, but with alignment. Small groups coordinating too well. Resources moving too cleanly. Silence where friction should have been. I recognized the shape immediately. The difference this time was that it didn't escalate. Something was interrupting it early. Not dismantling it, slowing it. Forcing adjustments before momentum could form. The pattern felt familiar in a way that tightened my chest. I checked timelines. The intervention points were precise. Always just ahead of consequence. Whoever was involved understood escalation curves, understood how little effort it takes to redirect something before it becomes visible. That wasn't institutional behavior. That was personal. For the first time in years, I felt the pull to look deeper. Not out of fear, out of recognition. The quiet kind. The kind that comes when you realize a decision you thought had concluded is still walking beside you. I didn't dig through records. I didn't search names. I watched outcomes. And the outcomes told me enough. Someone was still choosing restraint over resolution. Someone was still operating outside the need for credit, outside the need for protection. The kind of work that can only be done by someone who understands what happens when systems act too late. I wondered if you remembered me. Not in the way people remember faces, but in the way you remember intersections, moments where paths cross briefly and then separate, altered by the contact. Maybe he didn't think of me at all. That was fine. The point was never recognition. It was continuation. I declined a request shortly after, an aggressive response option that would have produced immediate results and long-term instability. I framed it as unnecessary. Premature. Inefficient. It was accepted without debate. That surprised me. The environment had changed more than I realized. Decisions like that would have been challenged years ago. Now, restraint had credibility. Silence had weight. I didn't claim responsibility for that shift. But I knew where it had started. The return wasn't dramatic. There was no message, no signal meant for me. Just the quiet understanding that the consequences of mercy don't always conclude. Sometimes they persist. Sometimes they evolve. And sometimes, they return not to ask for anything, but to remind you that the line you stepped across once still exists, even if it isn't visible anymore. I didn't feel fear. I felt confirmation. The man who wasn't supposed to survive hadn't become a liability. He hadn't become a solution either. He'd become something harder to categorize. A presence. And in that moment, I understood the final cost of mercy. It isn't paid all at once. It's paid in awareness, every time you recognize the shape of restraint where force would have been easier. And once you learn to see it, you can't stop. Because the story doesn't end when the danger passes. It ends when you stop noticing what didn't happen. I was still noticing. Which meant the story wasn't finished yet. I never saw him again. Not directly. Not indirectly. Not in any way that could be confirmed or denied. And that, I think, was intentional. People who survive by restraint don't return to intersections they've already crossed. They move parallel, close enough to matter, far enough to remain untouched. What remained wasn't a person. It was a change in how I saw decisions. Years after that first mission, after the contact and the quiet cooperation and the slow fading of the threat, I realized something uncomfortable. The cost of mercy wasn't the risk I'd taken or the obligation I'd carried. It was the permanence. Once you choose not to end something, you inherit whatever it becomes. You don't get to claim surprise later. You don't get to pretend the outcome is separate from the decision. I carried that forward into every judgment after. When presented with options that promised clean resolution, I started asking what they erased along with the problem. When force looked efficient, I asked what it delayed instead of solved. Not because I was hesitant, but because I knew what patience could do. That made me harder to predict. It also made me harder to replace. Some people mistake that for wisdom. It isn't. It's memory. The system never thanked me. It never acknowledged the decision or the ripple that followed. That was expected. Systems don't reward outcomes they can't fully control. They absorb them and move on. But I didn't. I kept track in the only way that mattered, by noticing when something didn't escalate, when a crisis dissolved without explanation, when silence appeared where chaos should have taken root. Those moments became familiar. Not comforting. Familiar. Mercy didn't turn the world gentler. It didn't remove danger or create certainty. What it did was teach me that not every threat needs to be eliminated to be neutralized. Some only need to be interrupted by someone willing to carry the uncertainty forward. That's what I'd done. That's what he'd done too. The man who wasn't supposed to survive didn't become a hero or a villain. He became a reminder that endings are often chosen because they're easier to live with in reports, not because they're right. I let one man walk away. I didn't know what it would cost me. Now I do. It cost me the ability to believe that decisions end when the moment passes. They don't. They stay active, shaping what comes next, demanding attention long after the danger fades. That's the real hidden chapter. Not the mercy itself. But the responsibility that follows, quietly, permanently, and without ever asking whether you're ready to keep carrying it. Hidden Chapters is about the choices that don't come with instructions. Like the video and subscribe for the next story. And if this decision were yours, would you act, or let the system decide?